funds back? And if you can't answer that question, I have the information.
Ms. Beatty, would you repeat the question? You were interrupted for a minute or so there.
Oh, I am sorry. I am at home recovering, so I hope sorry about any connection. Basically, hundreds of dollars have been removed from crypto wallets, and it's estimated that about 1 million people have money frozen in their exchange. Can you tell us how many users have lost money, and when will they get their money back?
Well, our process is such that, we are securing our assets every day. Every day we are out looking for wallets and the keys to those wallets to maximize the recovery of value. So that's an ongoing process. We've secured all of the cash in the bank accounts to the extent that we can at this point. We've secured crypto assets. We're still in the process of doing that. Ultimately, that's a question of months. The litigation has been pointed out by other members. Certainly will take a longer time frame, but that is our number one focus is to generate value to repay those customers. I don't have a customer account for you today. We do know that there was 2.7 million users in the U.S. silo, which again overstates the customer relationships because people had multiple trading accounts. And in the .com silo, we had over 7.6 million users, again, overstating the actual customer relationships due to the multitude of accounts by any particular customer. So we need to get to the bottom of those customer numbers.
Thanks, Mr. Ray. Let me ask you this. Despite the fact that FTX told customers it would not trade customers' funds, we know now that FTX loaned out, I think, about $10 billion in customer assets for proprietary trading. Mr. Ray, do you know how it was possible for FTX to access clients' funds in violation of its own terms of service that read, without clients' permission, and exposes customers to such massive loss?
Well, as I indicated, there was no corporate controls, no corporate oversight, no independent board, and the owners of the business, the senior management, had virtual control of the accounts of each of the silos and could move money or assets, as they desired, undetected by customers. So to the extent there were rules, and there were very few, obviously they were made to be broken.
So I think what I'm hearing you saying is that there was no one personally approved this. Let me ask you a last question. Can you tell us what regulatory changes could prevent the unauthorization or the unauthorizing customer funds in the future based on your wealth of experience?
Without speculating about what regulatory fix there could be, I've said in my earlier testimony, the critical thing is segregation of customer funds and transparency.
Okay, and lastly, in your 5 points that you outlined, and I'm sorry if you said it before, is there a timetable that you think you can get to that? And that can be a yes or no. I think I'm getting close to my time.
There's no particular time frame, but it's as quickly as possible. In my experience with Enron,
and is that months? Is that weeks? Quickly as possible.
It certainly isn't weeks. It's definitely months. And the causes of action, could take longer. But we will marshal assets on a weekly basis and on a monthly basis, and we'll do that as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much for taking the time to try to help us out. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Ray, in your declaration, you said that many of the companies in the FTX group did not have appropriate corporate governance and that this situation is unprecedented. You also, in your testimony today, said that the FTX collapse stems from the lack of an independent board and a complete failure of any internal controls or governance whatsoever. Can you elaborate in describing the governance structures for FTX.com that led you to make those comments?
Well, first and foremost, there's no independent board of directors. So one of the first things that I did was put on an independent board of directors, led by our chairperson, who's the former U.S. attorney and Honorable Joseph Farnan, former U.S. District Court judge. So put in a corporate structure of independent directors, put in separate officers, the new officers of the company. I put in a new CFO, a new chief information officer, a new head of administration, all independent, with some background and experience in these sectors. None of the employees. I mean, there's a lot of titles in the company, but no experience to back it up.
Can you explain how the FTX.com governance structure differs from the governance structures of FTX US?
Virtually no difference. There was no structure.
Mr. Ray, in your work so far, have you examined the governance structure or the flow of assets to the FTX Foundation or its various affiliates, including FTX Community, FTX Climate, or the Future Fund?
We are digging into that. We've not completed our review.
I am curious in your work whether or not you will determine whether those entities were established properly as non-profits or whether or not the funds received were improperly transferred customer accounts. Do you have any visibility into that yet?
We're looking at that right now. We've asked our folks at Ernst & Young to look at the tax side of it, and we're investigating the money transfers. So you can be sure we're going to dig into those details.
Was the FTX Foundation and those other not-for-profit, ostensibly not-for-profit entities, were they completely separate from any of the for-profit entities?
They were owned by Sam Bankman-Fried. I can't tell you that they were separate because they got funds from Alameda. So we know the source of their funding was from the FTX group. There was separate ownership, but not separate, funding.
So commingled assets in that case as well.
Absolutely.
Okay. At least one ESG ratings firm gave FTX a higher score for governance than ExxonMobil. Given your testimony that FTX's collapse stems from the absolute concentration of control in the hands of a very small group of grossly inexperienced and unsophisticated individuals who failed to implement virtually any of the systems or controls necessary for a company that is entrusted with other people's money or assets, what would you say about this ESG governance rating, which rated FTX higher than ExxonMobil?
I'd get my money back.
Can you identify which entities had audited financial statements?
Yes, I can. So there was no audit at Alameda, no audit at the venture silo. There was audit at the U.S. silo, and also audit at the .com silo. I can't speak to the integrity or quality of those audits. We're reviewing, obviously, the books and records. And as I've said earlier, much of those books and records were maintained on fairly unsophisticated ledger workbooks.
And you testified of the lack of record keeping.
Yes.
And so there's a whole lot of financial statements that are either not audited or not available. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say.
In your declaration, you stated that you did not believe that those audited financial statements were reliable. Can you elaborate on why you believe that to be the case?
Well, we've lost $8 billion, right, of customer money. So by definition, I don't trust a single piece of paper in this organization.
Sam Bankman-Fried, in his testimony to this committee on December 8th of last year, said that FTX has designed and offered a platform with a market structure that is risk-reducing. To be sure, there are irresponsible actors in the digital asset industry, and those actors attract the headlines, but FTX is not one of them. Was that statement incorrect?
False. Yes.
Thank you. And let me conclude by describing what is going on here by a popular crypto commentator. If you set up an exchange where you're the market maker, you're the issuer, you're the prime broker, and then you trade against your own customers, you have a vested interest in creating the assets, promoting the assets, and manipulating the price of the assets. What you have is a crypto casino. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to begin by thanking you once again for taking the lead to hold bad actors accountable and pursue transparency in the cryptocurrency space. And also, Mr. Ray, I want to thank you for being here today to testify. I think I start off a little bit like Paul Krugman does in the New York Times. I don't get the point. I really don't get the point of blockchain and cryptocurrency. It's like keeping track of how many times you chew gum. Like, who cares? There's other ways that are, I think, less fraudulent to make transactions. But anyway, that being said, how many times have we talked here about the potential for abuse, fraud in the crypto market? Quite a bit. We've had a lot of cheerleading from some people, especially on the other side of the aisle. I don't hear it today. Haven't heard it yet, but I do want to hear it like we normally hear it, how wonderful it is and how they shouldn't be regulated by the SEC, that they're too tough on them. Imagine we're not going to hear that today, especially after what we saw with FTX. But we do want to see order and transparency in this industry and throughout the financial markets. If you are an issuer of cryptocurrency or a manager of cryptocurrency exchange, and you conduct business with U.S. customers, consider this FTX collapse as your public service announcement. Come into compliance with the Securities Act of 1933, the Securities Act of 1934, and all other applicable federal and state laws. Do not skirt the law, mishandle U.S. citizens' funds, and then claim innocence. For the cryptocurrency industry to continue, citizens need to be informed, regulators need to uphold the laws, and companies need to comply. Now that wasn't happening, was it, Mr. Rander, this particular company?
No, sir.
Why wasn't it?
Again, you have control in a small group of individuals without any oversight whatsoever, from an independent board or experienced managers. It's just a recipe for problems.
What government entity is responsible for this fiasco?
That's not for me to say.
No, it is for you to say. You're right there. I'm asking you. If you had to opine, that's why you're there in the hot seat. Who is it? Should the SEC have been more aggressive, even though we had a lot of our friends on the other side saying they shouldn't have been? Should the SEC have been more aggressive?
I'm not experienced. I'm not a regulatory lawyer. I'm not here to express views about who should regulate it. And I've said and very clearly that we need transparency. Customers need to have segregated accounts. They need to have ownership. It's their money, it's assets. It's really no different than a bank. You'd expect the same level of scrutiny of any funds that you have on deposit with someone else. That is a minimum.
I agree with everything you've said, but at the same time, I have to say that the product that they give is a hybrid product, is it not?
Well, certainly it's a currency. It's an alternative currency, yes.
So then who should regulate it?
I don't have an opinion on that.
You don't?
Mr. Carson, no.
Okay. Well, that's the whole problem, I think. I don't get the point of cryptocurrency to begin with, other than, if you're a terrorist or someone that wants to hide money, and then I get the point. But other than that, I don't get the point myself. But if we are going to have it, we have to regulate it. Someone has to be in charge. We have to make sure that we don't continue to defraud the American people. And that's where the government comes in. Somebody's got to take charge of this. I think it's the SEC. I've always thought it was the SEC. They had a lot of pushback from my friends on the other side. I didn't hear them quite today, pushing back as they normally do. I'd love to see that. But again, someone has to regulate this if it's going to exist. Don't you agree?
I certainly think there has to be more controls in this sector. Who should regulate it? I defer to this committee.
That, Madam Chair, I yield my time back. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ray, for being here. Appreciate it. There's been many comparisons that have been made as people examine what happened to FTX, and from Bernie Madoff to Enron, it looks like this will go down as one of the largest frauds in history. And Mr. Ray, you have a unique perspective on the fact that you have worked on the Enron bankruptcy. I'd be interested real quick if you talk a little bit real quick about how it compares. You got cut off in an early time, and I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
You know, Enron was a, you know, is a really a different company. You know, was a crimes that were committed there were highly orchestrated financial machinations by highly sophisticated people to keep, you know, transactions off balance sheets. You know, this is really old-fashioned embezzlement. This is just taking money from customers and using it for your own purpose. Not sophisticated at all. Sophisticated perhaps in the way they were able to sort of hide it from people, frankly, right in front of their eyes. But this isn't you know, sophisticated whatsoever. This is just plain old embezzlement.
Old school.
Old school.
There you go. It seems like Freed has some interesting ideas on how he can stay relevant in the FTX world, and even after stealing customers' money and driving the company into bankruptcy. And I have read that he wants to be retained as an outside consultant, and been very critical of your own appointment, quite frankly, into this position. So after his arrest last night, all of his wishes seem even more unlikely. So what role, if any, should he play in FTX moving forward?
The role he's currently playing.
Okay.
Zero.
Good. You stated that FTX was a platform allowing for users to trade digital assets. Were users engaging in simple exchanges of assets, or were users permitted to engage in leveraged complex transactions?
Yes. I'm sorry. Could you repeat your question?
Sure. You stated that FTX was a platform allowing for users to trade digital assets. Were users engaged in simple exchanges of assets, or were users permitted to engage in leveraged complex transactions?
Yes.
Okay. You also stated that you have recovered over $1 billion in assets. Can you give a description of the nature and type of assets you have recovered to date?
We've recovered over $1 billion of crypto assets. These are, you know, coins of various nature, and we've secured those. That's been our primary focus. We've certainly also secured, you know, our cash in all of our bank accounts. The bank accounts were frozen. We've got control over those accounts with new authorized users, which, you know, certainly includes myself. But our main goal is to secure the cash and secure the crypto assets, and that is an ongoing venture.
Okay. Thank you for being here, and I yield my time back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Guam, Mr. San Nicolas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Ray, thank you for being with us here today. There's a lot of people following this, trying to understand what happened for a variety of reasons. Of course, your primary responsibility will be to make sure that the creditors are made whole, as well as depositors and everybody else who has a stake in varying degrees within the company. My first question is, have you been able to pinpoint the specific cause for FTX's collapse? I know that there's all kinds of stories about loans to the owner and no internal controls, loans to Alameda, commingling. But is there a specific trigger point or a specific cause that has resulted in the FTX collapse?
You know, I think I've described it. It's really just the unlimited ability of those in control positions to borrow customer funds or take customer funds and then deploy them for their own use. That use involved margin trading, which is inherently, you know, risky. And of course, they've spent enormous amounts of money beyond that. But it's really the misuse of funds, and it's as simple as that, you know, on a large scale basis.
So what is the big picture balance loss as a result of this bankruptcy? How much has FTX lost as a result of this?
We don't have exact numbers, but we know
Ballpark?
It's several $1 billion, you know, in excess of $7 billion.
In excess of $7 billion.
Yes.
So in excess of $7 billion, we're saying that the Sam Bankman-Fried and Company basically took or misallocated $7 billion, and that's why FTX has collapsed.
Right. So funds were taken from customers, funds were invested, trading losses incurred in Alameda, and then funds were deployed that'll never be, valued at the same dollar amount. There was over $5 billion of investments made. Certainly there's some value there, and we will try to get that value, and sell those assets. But oftentimes, even when he made those sorts of investments, whether it was directly or through others in management, sometimes he would do that really without any pro forma or any valuation. Not really quite sure how some of the purchase price numbers were derived. So it gives you a sort of worry, obviously, that the purchases were overvalued. So there's a concern there as well.
So Alameda lost $7 billion as a result of investment decisions and margin trading.
There's a multitude of reasons that cause the gap in assets between the customer balances and what's there today and what we hope to gain. It can't be pinpointed just on losses on trading activity.
The reason I'm asking, and I'm just kind of narrowing it down because my time is expiring, but it's important for us to very clearly understand what caused this collapse. When we had the 2008 financial crisis and Bear Stearns collapsed and Lehman Brothers collapsed, we could have gone in there and we could have pointed to all these different reasons that could potentially have contributed to it. But the underlying reasons were there was a subprime crisis and a lack of liquidity in these respective institutions. That allowed us to have a policy response, a regulatory response to prevent that kind of thing from occurring in the future. The FTX collapse right now is just FTX, but are these lack of controls and are these environments that resulted in the FTX collapse, are those still existing today? And could the same thing happen in similar operations such as Binance, for example? Could they also engage in the same activities under the current regulatory regime? And if things go wrong, have the same outcome?
Well, sort of just 3 points I'd make. First of all, we are going to detail the sources and uses and what happened to all the funds. That will tell us exactly, how the losses were incurred. Some of those may be lessons learned. Some of them just, frankly, will just be payments that were made, from other people's money. It's
just going back to my question, though, Mr. Ray. The circumstances that led to FTX's collapse, those circumstances still exist in the crypto space, and can other companies collapse in a similar set of circumstances?
Well, certainly we've ceased trading, so it won't happen in our company. Could it happen at other companies? I can't speak to them because I don't know how each of these companies are operated. Obviously, our company operated in a very distinct way that led to losses, but I think every company is different.
My time's expired.
Gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I appreciate you being here, Mr. Ray. Glad to have you before the committee, and I want to thank the ranking member, Mr. McHenry, and the Chair Waters, for working constructively in the digital asset space over the past 4 years. And I want to remind my colleagues that Mr. McHenry talked about bond ripoffs in the railroad expansion in the 1870s and 1880s. True. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac leading us down the primrose path in the early 2000s on housing ownership in the secondary market. And there were frauds and fraudulent actors. But it didn't mean that we didn't want to invest in railroads in the United States for the history of the country. And it didn't mean that we don't need a vigorous single-family housing market and secondary market in our country. So let's not confuse the malfeasance and disgusting activity of FTX with the fact that we need a proper, thoughtful regulatory oversight of digital assets. And so I thank Chair Waters and Ranking Member McHenry. 14 years ago this week, Bernie Madoff was arrested and charged with operating the largest Ponzi scheme in American history. Its collapse injured 37,000 investors and led to major reforms at the Securities and Exchange Commission and their oversight, and FINRA. Bankman-Fried was arrested in the Bahamas last night. In many ways, the fall of FTX dwarfs that of Bernie Madoff, with court filings suggesting that over 1 million creditors are somewhere in the lurch in the FTX silos. Americans were hurt, and I want everyone listening to know in today's hearing that this is just the first step that Congress is taking in understanding what happened and how to create the appropriate regulatory environment. We do want to understand the events and decisions that led to the collapse and the impact on our customers and other market participants and how to prevent it from happening again. Mr. Ray, thanks for stepping up in your leadership capacity. And in looking at the bankruptcy filing, Prager Metis was the audit firm for the .com silo. Their website says they're the first ever CPA firm in the metaverse. So looking at their website, they have 24 offices, 600 staff, 100 partners, principally California, New York, and New Jersey. You stated you're not familiar with Prager Metis, is that correct?
That's correct.
Are they cooperating with your in your role as bankruptcy trustee?
We're reaching out to, you know, both firms, audit firms, as well as the firm that did our taxes, and we certainly have tools available if they don't cooperate, but everyone seems to be cooperating at this point.
And are they, you anticipate they'll actively participate in the forensic accounting work you're doing with Ernst & Young?
Absolutely not. No, we are taking information that we get from the prior auditors and accountants and tax professionals, and then we're going to take our investigation from there on an independent basis.
Can you tell us who the partner in charge is of the audit at that firm?
I can't tell you. I can't tell you off the top of my head.
Is it Jerry Etel, Brian Goldblatt, Michael Williams? Those names ring a bell?
No, it's not. I can get I can get your staff.
Would you provide that to us, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you. And then the second auditing firm are Menino. You say you are familiar with them, and that's part of a London-based firm, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And so do you feel the same way about their performance based on the books and records you've seen, that they also were inadequate in serving as an auditing firm?
You know, I don't want to, you know, I certainly don't want to disparage that firm. We do have to look through the books and records and look at the audits themselves and see how comprehensive they were, to see if the audit would have picked up anything that we see. And certainly we're going to look at the related party disclosures that are in those audits, whether there's any footnotes or exceptions. We need to go, you know, we need to go back and look at all those audits just from a look back perspective to determine what maybe could have been done that wasn't done.
Do you anticipate the United States being a creditor in these proceedings, either for tax purposes?
It's premature to tell. I mean, we're certainly looking at that ourselves, and to the extent that we find any irregularities in the tax area, we'll certainly be notifying the IRS, but nothing we've seen at this point. But again, our investigation is so early.
You state that the internal controls were the weakest that you've seen sort of in your experience, but FTX US and FTX.com, essentially there is no distinction between those. And so whether you were an international investor or a domestic investor, it's all the same pot. Is that fair to say?
I mean, that is certainly our worry. I mean, there's a limited amount of U.S. customers in the .com exchange, but we are focused on, you know, commingling, and we're worried that the silos weren't respected for purposes of the crypto assets.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ray, for being here and for undertaking this remarkably complicated task. You know, at the end of the day, our job here is to learn from the mistakes that were made, who made them, and what we can do going forward. Like it or not, we're moving into a crypto assets, crypto world, and we really do need to learn. This whole thing has the feeling of a Hollywood blockbuster. That's why the cameras are here, right? We've got a 30-year-old gazillionaire who raised billions of dollars living in some condo with a bunch of young people, exotic products, tokens, and crypto assets. It feels to me, though, as I look through particularly the SDNY indictment unsealed this morning, that a lot of what we're seeing here is as old as the hills. It's wire fraud. It's misleading investors. It's commingling of funds. This is as old as the hills. There is something that I really do want to ask you about, though, which is a little different here. All the good work you've done with other companies, you were dealing with, by and large, money in banks or in other financial institutions. Here we've got tokens, which evidently were things of, quote, value, valued in some way or another, that were used as collateral, living in places called wallets, not in banks. So my question for you, that feels to me like what's exotic and different about this. How much more challenging is your job going to be because you're now operating in a world of tokens and wallets as opposed to dollars and banks? And what might, I know you're hesitant to get into regulatory questions, but what should we be thinking about, if nothing else, to help with more smooth unwindings of the inevitable bankruptcies that will occur in this industry moving forward?
The principal issue that the company is facing in the crypto area, and it is from a technology perspective, it is different from the other bankruptcies because it is it's not a plane, not a boat. It's this crypto asset, and it has inherently some difficulties. The assets can be taken or lost. We have assets that are in what are called hot wallets, and those are in cold wallets. Hot wallets are very vulnerable to hacking. If you've done any looking on the internet, you'll find that hacking is almost ordinary course in this business sector. There are lots of vulnerability to the wallets. So that's this company, unfortunately, had a very challenging record here. For some transfers, there was no pathway for it. Our keys aren't stored in a centralized location. We don't know where all of our wallets are. Passwords were sometimes kept in just plain text format. So this company was sort of uniquely positioned to fail. The lack of discipline on control of the wallets, their storage, the storage of passwords, allowing multiple users to set up accounts, almost created an environment where there was not a complete inventory of wallets. You can learn some lessons from that. I mean, you need to have more controls, more discipline, more centralized accounting functions, more oversight and management. That's not to say that things won't happen. The hacking might occur.
Yeah. Thanks, Mr. Ray. I have one more question, but I really appreciate that. We got to follow up on that because that's something for us to do. The other thing that I can't stop thinking about here is, again, 30-year-old gazillionaire. I get it, all sorts of attractive things. Some of the supposedly smartest money on the planet, venture capitalists who are paid tens of millions of dollars to invest money. And I wouldn't care if it was just the money of the very wealthy, but they're investing pension money. They're investing university endowments, companies like Lightspeed, Sequoia, Greylock, the best of the best invested in this. And you told us, and you made a statement that this was the worst governance, the worst you had ever seen. Did you see any evidence of any appreciable due diligence on the part of these entities that gave Sam Bankman-Fried hundreds of millions of dollars?
Yeah, I'm not aware of what these parties may have done in terms of their due diligence. It is surprising, obviously, in light of all the circumstances. But I don't know what they did internally to verify these investments. So well, obviously, only they know that.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yield back.
Gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Ray. Like everyone else, we're appreciative of you being here today and testifying. I'm going to start, for my part, with a series of quick questions that hopefully will assist this committee's investigation. And then I want to move on to some additional points, time permitting. Mr. Ray, there were over 100 corporate entities within FTX Group. Some had boards of directors and others did not. Was there a group-level board of directors overseeing the entirety of FTX?
No, there was not.
Would you agree that it's a bad decision for a complex firm like FTX to not have a top-level board of directors?
Yes.
Do you have concerns about the concentration of power in a small group of inexperienced individuals with no oversight?
Yes.
Did FTX.com have basic corporate functions like an accounting or human resource department?
No.
Was there a legal department at FTX.com?
Yes, there was.
Was there a compliance department?
There were people with titles.
Fair enough. And thank you. To assist the committee's investigation, would you agree that a financial firm the size of FTX needs accounting, human resources, legal, compliance, and risk departments to help prevent something like this from happening?
Absolutely.
In early April 2022, FTX and IEX announced a strategic partnership. Last week, the Financial Times reported on Alameda's venture capital portfolio, which listed FTX Trading's $270 million investment into IEX as a, quote, acquisition. Did FTX Trading acquire IEX? And if not, what type of investment did FTX Trading make into IEX?
I'd have to get back to the committee on that specific investment. I'm not sure that was completed.
Can you provide us with some information on it?
Absolutely, I can get back to you on the staff.
We know that Chair Gensler had more meetings with FTX than anyone else in the crypto industry. We understand that what was being negotiated was a framework for digital asset exchange registration and token registration with the SEC that would benefit both parties. It would expand the SEC's jurisdiction in exchange for the SEC's preferential treatment of FTX over other industry participants. We understand there was a lot of activity to move this idea forward, including the circulation of draft short-form disclosures that would enable filers to get tokens listed on this newly formed bespoke exchange. Mr. Ray, I know you're handicapped with the information you currently have obtained, but Chair Gensler refuses to answer our questions or testify before this committee. Will you commit to sharing with this committee any internal documents you come across regarding communication between FTX and Mr. Gensler or others at the SEC?
We'll fully cooperate, with the committee and the regulatory authorities with respect to our investigation.
Again, specifically, I just want copies of this committee will want copies of those communications to the extent they exist.
We can certainly work with your staff to get you what you need.
Thank you. And Mr. Ray, I appreciate you mentioning your concerns in the beginning of my questioning about the concentration of power in a small group of individuals with no oversight. That is the exact problem that open and permissionless technology like crypto and blockchain solve. It solves for the problems of centralization. You stated in your testimony that you've never seen such a, quote, utter failure of corporate controls at every level of an organization, from the lack of financial statements to a complete failure of any internal controls or governance whatsoever, close quote. FTX had disastrous or even non-existent systems for accounting, audit, cash management, cybersecurity, human resources, risk management, and other unacceptable management practices that currently make your job to uncover the facts quite difficult. Fortunately, the immutable characteristics of public blockchains that some people would care not to understand in this committee allowed the crypto community to reveal Sam Bankman-Fried's fraud, and the on-chain public record will assist law enforcement moving forward. I encourage my colleagues to understand Sam Bankman-Fried's con for what it is: a failure of centralization, a failure of business ethics, and a crime. It is not a failure of technology. I've worked across the aisle since I came to Congress, so the future of crypto reflects American values, the same way the internet does today. For the most engaged members of Congress on crypto policy, the FTX collapse reminds us of why we care so deeply about this technology. Decentralization is the point. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, who is also the vice chair of the subcommittee on investor protection, entrepreneurship, and capital markets, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Ray, thank you so much for this. I'm struck by a lot here. Not least Mr. Perlmutter's comment that this is going to take a long time to untangle. Maybe your comment to Mr. Lucas that this is a paperless bankruptcy saves you time because you run out of paper. But I appreciate your service. A bunch of questions. One, I just want to clarify because it's all been implicit. All this bankruptcy is dollar denominated, correct? So as you go through to chase down values.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I ask that because we've talked about commingling, we've talked about customer losses. There's been some public reporting suggesting that there may have been some inflation or misrepresentation of the value of FTT tokens. Is that, and I'm not asking you to opine on that right now, but to the extent there is some customer loss claimed from that, is that also one of the categories of losses you're going after?
Well, FTT, I'm sorry, was on that balance sheet of Alameda, and it certainly was served as effectively sort of collateral. And it was largely controlled by Alameda, so it was a very illiquid token. It was effectively a token created, by the company itself with a limited float. So, inherent in the token itself was the illiquidity, and certainly the size of the position the company had in its own token, contributed to this problem.
But if a customer were to buy that token at some value that because of its illiquidity could be manipulated, would the customer not effectively be sitting on, for lack of a better word, a Forex risk?
Well, there's certainly, all the crypto, like any asset, it has a certain volatility to it, and some are more volatile than others, and FTT was very volatile.
Sure, and I'm just, to the extent that the volatility is natural, it's fine. To the extent it's manipulated, it's separate. Let me move on because we're close on time. There's been, in a number of the public conversations that Sam Bankman-Fried has had, when asked about commingling, he often responds by talking about open margin positions. I want to just give you a chance to react to the difference between an open margin position and the commingling that you've observed.
I'm not sure exactly. I tried to follow some of what his statements were, and it was very, very hard to really understand what he was really trying to say. We do know that they had open margin positions at various times in Alameda, and Alameda was a customer, if you will, of the exchange, and it's through that customer relationship plus other arrangements that allowed Alameda to borrow those funds and then take positions on the exchange like anyone who had hedged an asset in the market. He had usually large positions, of course, and sometimes they were wrong in those positions and they resulted in big losses. But ultimately, the commingling issue is the same and a different issue. He took the money from FTX to cover those positions. And ultimately, when customers went to get their money back from .com, there was a run on the bank.
Okay. On November 12th, I guess just the second day or the first day you were there,
yes,
there was a hacker who stole some $477 million worth of tokens from FTX. It was a November 29th interview with Mr. Bankman-Fried with Tiffany Fong when he said he's narrowed it down to like 8 people, quote. Have you had any discussions with him? Do you have any sense of do you have any more visibility since November 12th on that hack? Have you had conversations with him about who those 8 people might be? What's your $477 million?
I've not had any conversations with him. We're relying on forensic and cybersecurity experts who are tracking the crypto. It is an open interface, so you can see, you can ultimately find where the crypto ends up. We've had law enforcement involved, so we're tracking it. I think we got all the help we need in that front.
Okay. As I get close on the end of my time here, so far it seems like most of the losses have been within these 4 silos, and 2.7 million customers, whatever that means, is some exposure. Are you worried about any broader contagion? Are there broader contagion issues we should worry about from our perspective here? Certainly other bankruptcies of the scale have spilled into other sectors.
Look, I think the industry, we've made a number of investments in the crypto sector. If you look at that portfolio of $5 billion, one of our major investments, top 20 investments were in the crypto sector. So it's a very trying time for the crypto sector. And what I worry about is the impairment to that portfolio of $5 billion, because obviously that's a recovery pool for our customers.
Thank you. Yield back.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Ray, I know you referenced earlier that you had not yet read Sam Bankman-Fried's testimony that was prepared for today. I had a question that I wanted to ask, and I was going to read you something that he had included in his remarks. In late 2021, I believe that Alameda Research likely had a net asset value of substantially over $50 billion market to market. I believe that Alameda was likely leveraged long, perhaps about 1.1 times leverage. That is, it had corresponding assets for roughly 90% of its position, borrowing the remaining 10%. That was roughly 1/20th of the maximum leverage FT allowed and roughly 1/3 of the leverage assumed by the average FT margin trader. In early November 2022, over a 3-day period, the market value of assets that Alameda Research had held declined dramatically, I believe, by more than 50%. Have you yet seen any evidence of a market value drop in Alameda's assets before November 2022?
We haven't gone back to trace, you know, the actual, I mean, to compare his statements with what actually happened in the marketplace. I mean, clearly there was volatility and a huge market drop in crypto over that 12-month period. So it wouldn't surprise me that, you know, his leverage numbers changed, perhaps even dramatically during that time period. I think the problem at the heart of this is that, you know, his positions, you know, the collateral he had behind that, he didn't have the same auto liquidation provision that a margin account would normally have. You usually can't lose, you know, if it's structured properly, you shouldn't be able to lose more than your collateral. Otherwise, the position closes out and there's no harm. And the brokerage firm, you know, isn't, if it's a brokerage account, for example, it wouldn't be short cash. They wouldn't have to go out to get the money from you. You close out the position. None of that existed with the Alameda positions. They had almost a complete ability to lose money beyond their collateral.
Are you yet in a position to be able to describe, summarize the assets that Alameda had?
We do have an inventory of the investments we made. That's pretty clear. We've got those in the hands of our investment bankers at Perella, and we're trying to understand those investments. Ultimately, we'll market those investments. You'll see this week that some of those investments will be put up for sale. The crypto assets a little bit different. What's on the exchanges we can see. There's exchanges, about 24 exchanges across the world where we know we have crypto assets. They're in our name. We're securing those and are moving those into cold storage. We have, you know, other positions in cold wallets and hot wallets. We've got visibility to that. The question really is, are there wallets that we don't know about? Certainly that is the potential, because the way this company was organized, there may be wallets that don't have our names. We don't know where they are. And that's going to be a difficult task ahead of us. But what we can see, what we have visibility to, we're grabbing control over.
So we'll learn more this week.
We should learn more in the coming weeks.
Mr. Ray, you mentioned the documentation that you don't have earlier during your testimony. Can you share what documents you have uncovered with respect to the transfer of funds from FTX to Alameda?
It's voluminous. The record keeping, wasn't very clean in the company, but we should be able to trace the movement of crypto assets. I mean, inherently in the nature of the crypto, you should be able to see the movement and where it started and where it ended up. We'll obviously track, the banking information. We do have bank records. Sometimes we have to go right to the source, right to the bank to get historical records because they're not, in hand, if you will, at the company. But one way or another, we'll get the banking records and we'll be able to trace the sources of cash, how that cash was utilized to buy assets. Once we can identify the assets, we can then trace the asset from either, transfer to other currencies or ultimate, payment outside the company. So it's just a very intense forensic process, but we'll have the records ultimately to do that.
We'd be interested in receiving more detailed explanation of the documents that you have. And one last question, can you describe what documents you identified with respect to internal controls and governance?
Well, there isn't any, to speak of. I mean, the company is virtually void of any internal controls or documentation. Resolutions are absent. Authorizations approving massive loans. For example, the loans of the insiders. I haven't seen any resolutions approving those. When Sam Bankman-Fried signs on behalf of the company and then he signs his own loan, that should tell you a lot right there.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, who is also the chair of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Ray, thank you for your testimony here today. You know, if you've been a member of Congress as long as I have been, it just seems eerily it was you that had to take over Enron when I was sitting here at that particular time. And we were looking at that as being one of the biggest scandals that we've ever seen. And now, I believe in your testimony today, you said this may be even bigger, of which is really concerning to me, particularly since I do believe that blockchain technologies have a role in fostering financial inclusion that facilitates cross-border transactions. But what we didn't have and what we don't have are the real safeguards against misuse by bad actors. As a result of that, I know I've been intricately involved with New York State. And New York State was one of the first nations to create a virtual currency license and supervisory framework. In your testimony, you were very frank about the total lack of internal controls in FTX and critical of their governance structure. So I guess my first question to you is, in your estimation, how much did the lack of a board of directors attribute to the failure of FTX? And do you believe there would have been an opportunity to change course if this defunct structure were identified early on?
Yes, I do. I think that the lack of an independent board was a critical aspect of the failure.
And also in New York State, there are capitalization requirements for licensee holders to have highly liquid capital to ensure that financial integrity and to protect against outside shocks. Now, in this instance, how would a capital requirement have changed the outcome of the FTX failure?
I'm not a regulatory expert. I mean, what I've set forth in my testimony is that I think it's important for customer accounts to be segregated and for there to be transparency in what people can visualize in their account, and to have some strict rules relative to using customer assets. That's the extent of my views about the regulatory scheme. I defer to others who are obviously more experienced on the regulatory side.
That's one of the issues that we're trying to deal here, is how do we get the appropriate and the proper regulation so that we can make sure that individuals are protected. For example, do you know, and to what extent were U.S. persons trading on the FTX exchange? And do you believe that the controls were adequate in restricting access for U.S. persons? Because, FTX.com was listed in the Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And despite it being publicly reported that the U.S. subsidiary was a stronger position than its parent because of the narrowed offerings and oversights, there still seemed to be this direction toward U.S. Persons. So what do you think? Do you think that there should be, or the restricting access for U.S. persons or the controls were adequate?
Well, certainly there was a limited number of people that invested on the .com, which was not the intended use of that exchange. How that happened, obviously, we'll have to investigate, and where the breakdown was, internally in our controls, that would have allowed that to happen.
So I'd like, at some point, I know you're not a regulatory expert, but to have conversation with you about looking at some of the rules and the regulations that we put in place in the state of New York, because the debate that we have here at times is ceilings and floors and what would be appropriate to make sure that people are protected. You've already stated that FTX's lack of internal controls is unlike anything that you've ever seen in your career, and obviously has had a devastating impact on people who have trusted FTX with their savings and investments. I also chair the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'm also concerned that these internal failures could have led to sanction evasion and illegal transactions on FTX's platform at a time when sanctions compliance is critical for supporting countries like Ukraine and slowing down Putin's war machine. Have you and your team investigated these issues since taking the helm at FTX about anyone trying to avoid sanctions?
Yeah, we're certainly investigating all the aspects of the failure, and as the coming weeks, we'll learn more, and I think we'll certainly be willing to, work with the committee to understand really what happened and share with you to the extent possible.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ray, thank you for being here today. Unfortunately, we aren't able to question Sam Bankman-Fried. I was looking forward to that, and however, I was concerned that you were going to testify first. I would have rather have had him testify first so we could qualify some of the statements that he may make with you, who's in the current position. However, since we've been in here, there's been a leak of what was to be his testimony that has come out, and I'd like to ask you about something that he has related in his testimony. He said if he had not been arrested ahead of today's hearings, that he alleges that FTX US has been and remains solvent and could pay off all of its customers tomorrow. Given the evidence